Uber's not going to exist in a few years, as it's becoming clear that Uber is in very deep trouble. After more than 3,000 layoffs, the closure of dozens of their offices, and the company's stock value falling by 2/3 in only a year, it's becoming very clear that Uber is on its final legs. But how did such a promising company sink so low? Why is their stock continuing to fall, even after the company has finally managed to become profitable? What made the Uber empire crash down into the ground? Well, the first reason lies in Uber's business model. You see, from the start, the company's general way of doing business is by acting as a middleman between drivers and passengers. As we all know, a user simply enters their location and destination, and then a nearby driver can accept the trip. Once the trip's over, the payment is done through the app, and no money changes hands at any point. After the trip, both the drivers and passengers give each other ratings. And at first, this business model seems great. It's completely revolutionized the taxi industry. Uber is a much more convenient way of getting a taxi compared to all the other options. With just the press of a few buttons, you don't have to go through the hassle of calling up a taxi company. However, while this looks great on the outside, this business model is much more sinister than it first seems. For starters, Uber prefers for their drivers to be viewed as independent contractors rather than actual employees, meaning that technically, Uber doesn't have to pay any of their drivers a minimum wage, nor do they have to pay sick pay or any other kind of benefits whatsoever. Uber also doesn't own any of the vehicles and won't cover maintenance, fuel, or anything else. All of these burdens rest on the shoulders of their drivers. And from a purely economical standpoint, this business model is revolutionary. It's great for Uber because they don't have to pay their workers nearly as much as the traditional taxi services. However, Uber's problem was that lots of this was actually illegal. In fact, from the get-go, Uber's practices were illegal in San Francisco where they originated from, something that would quickly come back to bite Uber. However, back when Uber was founded, regulators hadn't caught on to their tactics yet, and so Uber had a very small period to monopolize the taxi industry and become too big to stop. And so in order to take over the taxi industry, the company would make many sacrifices by taking on heavy financial losses early on, all in the name of continuing their expansion. The only thing keeping Uber afloat was the large investments they were receiving, as Silicon Valley was betting that Uber was going to monopolize the modern transportation service industry. And if Uber was able to secure a monopoly, they would eventually become extremely profitable. If they were the only option on the market, Uber could then jack up the prices without worrying about being undercut by the competition. In fact, a monopoly was necessary for Uber due to the extremely thin profit margins that their business model gave them. However, the company's lack of profitability didn't faze Uber or their investors. They were putting all their chips on the rapid growth. And for a while, this paid off. In just a few short years, Uber services had been rolled out across the world. This was a genius strategy in a lot of ways, and this was all coming from one man known as Travis Kalanick, one of the key founders who created Uber. And it was also because of Kalanick that Uber became such a controversial company. But back in the early years of Uber, and the negative press towards the company wasn't anywhere near what it is today. In fact, at the time, Kalanick was a business prodigy. Under his leadership, Uber successfully expanded from a small San Francisco startup to a global sensation. And the strategy behind this was fairly simple. As we've discussed, Uber's business model was genius. Genius in the sense that they didn't have to pay their workers properly. And at the same time, Uber would offer insanely cheap deals to entice people to use their services. It wasn't uncommon for your first Uber trip to be free, or for the company to give you referral bonuses if you managed to get your friends to try out the app. These marketing methods exploded Uber's user base, with all of this only being possible due to the giant influx of angel investors flowing into the company. Without the investors, Uber would be nothing. And as Uber started catching on, the app would only become more and more popular, becoming a central part of millions of lives, allowing Uber to have substantial bargaining power later down the line. It seemed like everything was perfect for Uber. They had established themselves so tightly in modern society that it became so much harder for a city to ban or regulate Uber. This aggressive and borderline illegal strategy led to unprecedented growth, but it wouldn't take long for the consequences to catch up with Uber, because Uber's aggressive expansion had given Uber a lot of enemies. The first of these was San Francisco's local government. After the government started noticing how Uber was skirting regulations, they sent the company a cease and desist letter with substantial penalties if they did not comply. The notice threatened $5,000 fines for every trip and a possible 3-month jail sentence for every day the company continued operating. Now, for most people, this would have completely destroyed the company, but not Uber. Instead of abiding by the government's demands, Uber just continued operating. As Uber had already entrenched themselves so deeply into San Francisco, they were now coming to control the entire transportation market. Knowing how much power they now had, Uber released a press statement that snubbed the orders, stating, "Uber is a first-to-market, cutting-edge transportation technology, and it must be recognized that the regulations from both city and state regulatory bodies have not been written with these innovations in mind. As such, we are happy to help educate the regulatory bodies on this new generation of technology." This early statement from Uber was symbolic. It summarized their entire business model. Uber completely rejected the law and had an almost pompous attitude in saying saying that we are happy to, quote, educate the San Francisco government. However, this incident would only be the first of Uber's many brushes with the law, and this was all trickling down from Kalanick's leadership. Before he founded Uber, Kalanick previously started a company called Scour, but he had to shut it down after he was fined billions for copyright infringement. Kalanick never paid the full amount, of course, but this showed that he wasn't afraid of breaking the rules, and breaking the rules was exactly what Uber was doing. After establishing themselves in 2011 across the US, the taxi industries were certainly not happy with this. How could they compete with Silicon Valley funded, below minimum wage drivers who were completely outcompeting the taxi industry? The entire US taxi industry realized that if they couldn't put a stop to Uber, all of them would be out of business. Because of the pressure from these taxi organizations and other industry leaders, new legal measures were enacted across 15 major US cities, which included rules that seemed to be targeted directly towards Uber. For example, the government made it illegal to use a GPS as a meter for calculating drivers' fares. Additionally, cab drivers using their phone while driving was now forbidden, even if they were only using it for the Uber app. However, this didn't faze Uber. They'd already bypassed the San Francisco government. The Uber leadership realized they had so much power over the transportation industry that nothing could hold them back, not even the government. But one thing the company couldn't ignore was a class action lawsuit from over 350,000 former and current Uber drivers. The 2013 lawsuit suggested that Uber owed the drivers a minimum wage as well as sick pay while working for the company. This case would then drag out for years. Uber would use the best lawyers possible and eventually settled out of court with only a small portion of the claimants for around $20 million. These issues slowly became incredibly common for Uber, and the company was now starting to hemorrhage a lot of money. However, for now, this didn't matter. All that mattered was that Uber would expand across the world and monopolize the taxi industry. If they could do this, they would be $1 billion company. Of course, by this point, Uber was nowhere near being a profitable company, but this isn't exactly unusual for tech startups. The general model for these businesses is to operate on a loss for multiple years in exchange for user growth, as once you've built the client base, the business can eventually be made extremely profitable. This is the same with WhatsApp, Discord, or like how Amazon was running on a loss for years before it came to dominate the economy, and it seemed like Uber was following this trajectory, or so it seemed, because there were a few key reasons why this dream would never come to fruition for Uber, which leads us on to the second reason for why Uber is collapsing, and that point being that they actually failed to ever gain a monopoly. If you've been following my videos, I'm sure you know how suspicious I am of mainstream media, because oftentimes mainstream media can be the biggest impediment to understanding the truth and keeping you stuck in ideological bubbles. Ground News shows you how breaking news is being covered across the political spectrum. They do this by gathering news from 50,000 sources around the world and puts all related articles in one place so that you can easily compare coverage. By doing this, Ground News allows you to see the story behind the story, using data-driven analytics that looks at things such as political bias, reliability, and ownership of news outlets. I mean, check out this story about Putin announcing partial military mobilization, putting the country's people and economy on a wartime footing. Not only can I see that there are 416 sources reporting on this, but I can also quickly identify which sources have a political bias according to ratings from independent news monitoring organizations. And what's interesting about this particular story is that 43% of news outlets reporting on this are center, with varying degrees of factuality. Ground News also highlights the ownership data of these companies, from governments to media conglomerates and independent outlets. This data is invaluable in providing you the truth behind each news story, so go to ground.news/moon to try Ground News for free or subscribe to get unlimited access and support a small team of media outsiders working to make the news more transparent. Now back to the video. At first, Uber really did make up the entire market of this public transportation method, which is why Uber was finding so much success during the initial phase of its operations. Uber's system was the first of its kind. It was revolutionary. Until a competitor was launched, Uber essentially had a monopoly on this type of business model. Shutting down any kind of competition was key to ensuring longevity for the company, and if Uber played their cards right, it was possible for them to keep their monopoly on this kind of public transportation. This could be done through methods like making deals with taxi companies, or by offering better wages and service prices than any of their competition could afford. However, this wasn't the case. Uber's leadership was infatuated with the idea of disrupting the taxi industry rather than securing their foothold in the market. And it was because of this ill-advised mindset that competitors soon began popping up, and Uber would start to lose their footing as the undisputed king of public transportation apps. The main competition came in the form of Lyft, the second ride-sharing app and Uber's long-standing rival. Uber was Coke and Lyft was Pepsi. Lyft was marketing themselves as the underdog and a friendlier alternative alternative compared to Uber. Lyft would focus on reducing the anonymity between drivers and passengers, while also making user trip statistics as detailed as possible. Lyft was also prioritizing the implementation of extra safety features for their drivers, such as yearly background checks and a mandatory anti-sexual assault training program. But Lyft wasn't the only one. Soon there would be a bunch of apps all competing for Uber's market share, such as Bolt, who focused on the European, Latin American, and Near East markets. You see, in recent years, Bolt has expanded their operations to 45 countries and over 100 million customers. While these similar companies are all facing problems with legal regulations, their approach to expansion was much less aggressive than Uber's. Along with this new competition, Uber was also having issues making their entry into other countries. The legality in some countries made it either difficult or completely impossible for Uber to operate in some areas. Because Uber is a direct competitor to taxis, the app is banned in many locations. Germany, Portugal, and Italy have all partially banned Uber, while places like Denmark and Hungary have completely outlawed Uber, mainly due to the app stripping money that could be instead going towards taxi organizations as well as the government. And where Uber has been banned, other companies have now stepped in to fill the gap. For example, in Budapest, Bolt has thrived where Uber has been outlawed. Even in Denmark, where ride-hailing services are universally banned, Bolt has a fleet of e-bikes for hire. Not to mention Bolt Food, which has taken over the European markets by storm. A consequence of all this competition is that it has severely disrupted what was supposed to be Uber's endgame. This solid competition has killed any dream that Uber once had of a full monopoly on the ride-hailing industry. This was essential for Uber's business strategy to work. Without a monopoly, their plan is missing a crucial aspect. But it wasn't just the competition that stood between Uber and a monopoly. As everywhere Uber expanded, they would cause unrest, protests, and violence, which would soon become the third reason for Uber's downfall, their public perception. You see, their reckless expansion was leaving a wake of destruction. Uber's continuing war with the taxi industry was playing a massive part in this. On January 26th in 2016, over 2,000 French taxi drivers protested Uber's presence in Paris. They did this by blocking the roads, which quickly brought the city centre to a standstill, and what began as a relatively peaceful protest quickly turned violent. Over 20 taxi drivers were arrested for crimes like assault and arson, all targeted at Uber drivers. But it was only until recently that the full details were uncovered on how far Uber had gone to instigate the growing tensions and violence coming from taxi organizations. Mark McGann, a whistleblower and former Uber lobbyist, gave a clear window into Kalanick's and the company's tactics by leaking a set of documents that was coined the Uber Files. Thousands of these documents were leaked to The Guardian and later published in spring of 2022. The Uber Files detailed a plethora of reckless and negligent decisions coming from the company's upper management, and the name that came up the most in these leaked papers? CEO Travis Kalanick, who was quoted as saying this about the violent protests in France. Quote, "I think it's worth it. Violence guarantees success, and these guys must be resisted, no? Agreed that right place and time must be thought out." Uber's mission has always been to disrupt the taxi industry. However, the Uber Files make it clear that Kalanick and other executives of the company put the mission of agitation above the safety of their drivers. Not to mention the public. Uber's questionable reasoning behind sparking violence in the streets was that it would put pressure on regulators to inhibit taxi companies. Protests would lead to anti-taxi publicity, which would then cause regulators to sway towards Uber's side. However, this is a key reason that Uber is currently in deep trouble. The singular focus that Kalanick brought with him was excellent for the company's expansion, yet he was more of a wartime leader rather than a peacetime one. And so once the time came for Uber to consolidate their hold on the transportation industry, they had already built up too much bad blood with the wrong people. The taxi companies they've fought for years weren't very interested in making compromises once they knew they could survive Uber's innovations. All around the world, violence was erupting between taxi drivers and Uber drivers. In places like Cancun and Mexico, Uber drivers would actually be hunted down and even murdered by the Mexican taxi mafia. However, the Uber Files make clear that Uber has no problem with this. They will take advantage of these seemingly isolated incidents, all to be on top. For example, in early 2015, an Uber driver was assaulted by some masked men armed with knuckle dusters and a hammer who were believed to be taxi drivers. Uber's regional executives discovered the incident and exchanged emails about how best to use the scenario to their benefit. The victims in these cases were encouraged to file a police report by Uber with the aim of getting it shared with the press. One part of an Uber executive's email discussing this incident had this to say: "We keep the violence narrative going for a few days before we offer the solution. You see, all the violence, all the tension was just optics for Uber. They would incite violence and then do their best to spin the blowback to their own advantage. But if Uber was willing to incite violence to sway regulators, what else were they willing to do?" Well, like all major corporations, Uber had an army of lobbyists that were eagerly waiting to put large sums of money into the right politicians' pockets. And as usual, this was extremely effective. perspective. There have been many instances of countries or cities moving to ban Uber, then pulling out at the last minute. But even when this method of financial incentivization worked out, it was still a massive expense for Uber. And whenever these attempts did fail, it ended up becoming more money that Uber sent down the drain. Uber, Lyft and DoorDash combined have spent over $200 million attempting to force through a law that would strengthen all their grips on the gig economy. Known as Proposition 22, this would give additional benefits to these independent contractors, but the bill would ensure that workers are not labeled as employees. Uber even directly campaigned for this bill by advertising for it in their app. Despite substantial efforts from worker advocacy groups to prevent this proposition passed in November 2020, and for a moment it seemed like Uber's multi-million-dollar legal gamble had paid off. But only 6 months later after this verdict, the entire ruling was deemed unconstitutional and was subsequently nullified. This meant that Uber had wasted tens or potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, all for nothing. And to make matters even worse for Uber, this failed lobbying fell through during the height of the pandemic, when Uber's cash flow was already tanking due to the low demand for transportation. But one of the worst scandals for Uber were the allegations that would surface against a number of the company's top executives. In 2017, when a major sexual assault allegation went public, it would go on to further tarnish Uber's reputation even more. You see, earlier in the year, a blog post was written by former Uber engineer Susan Fowler, who alleged a culture of toxicity, harassment, and discrimination at the company. Uber responded to the outrage by ordering an inquiry into the assertion, and evidence was found that many of the company's executives were indeed complicit. But what many didn't suspect was that this behavior went straight to the top. Kalanick, along with 20 other top-level employees, were implicated and forced to sell all their Uber shares and immediately step down. Now, for a company that spoke so highly of modernization, it was a massive blow to their public image, especially due to many of the public's fears of sexual assault with Uber drivers. Kalanick was already on thin ice for his aggressive company growth policy, and this incident was just the final nail in the coffin for his career at Uber. But since his departure, things really haven't gotten any better. Just last year in 2021, London moved towards bringing much tighter regulations against Uber. The new legislation states that Uber must pay a minimum wage to the over 70,000 drivers in the UK, while also being required to provide holiday pay. This government order is incredibly expensive relative to Uber's standard payment model, and will further eat into any of the profits the company was hoping to make. Which brings us on to the fourth and final reason why Uber's in deep trouble. They just aren't profitable enough anymore. You see, all the legal fires that they have to put out internationally continues to hold back their profit margins, and these margins were either thin or non-existent to begin with. The pandemic also hit Uber especially hard, as demand for ride-hailing services was falling sharply. Although the company has somewhat recovered in recent months, it certainly can't be called smooth sailing. Surprisingly, Uber managed to make a profit of roughly $50 million in the last quarter of 2021, but they still have lost billions from their stakes in other companies. And this newfound profitability is mostly a result of the price hikes that Uber has been implementing into their app. In response to the growing issue of driver shortages, Uber has pledged to raise their fares by 5% in London alone, and if other locations follow the UK's lead in forcing Uber to treat drivers like employees, this will only mean more money lost for Uber. All of these problems just won't go away for Uber, and this is killing their worth as a company. Uber stock is currently sitting around $30 a share, but just a couple of years ago in early 2021, this was $60. And although Uber's recent profits could be seen as a good sign, it's still a long road to secure sustainable profits for the company. And that's why investors are pulling out of Uber. They've seen that Uber has failed to reach the monopoly it was destined for, and because of this, they're looking for alternatives. Although despite everything, there could possibly be a light at the end of the tunnel for Uber. Most of the company's problems are coming from their drivers, but with self-driving cars coming around the corner, and these problems might just be temporary. A fleet of autonomous vehicles would add some much needed stability to Uber's business model, but even this possibility might have its drawbacks. Right now, Uber doesn't have to pay any kind of maintenance or even fuel costs for the cars on their payroll, since that's all paid by the drivers instead. Uber would have to take on all these costs themselves if they switch to autonomous vehicles. Additionally, self-driving cars are a technology that still needs years of work before being truly safe. So even though this looks like a quick fix, it won't be materializing for Uber anytime soon. And this is a fact that Uber certainly knows all too well. In fact, in 2020, they pulled nearly all of their capital out of self-driving car research, even after spending billions on it. The program was already in jeopardy after a lack of results. But when one of Uber's prototype cars struck and killed a pedestrian in 2018, it was only a matter of time. But the incident still caused them to pull out of their ongoing research. And unfortunately for Uber, they don't have the money to burn on research anymore, which is why the future is looking incredibly doubtful for Uber. After over a decade of seemingly non-stop controversy, violence and chaos, the company's teetering on the brink of collapse, and only time will tell whether they can outlast the storm. But without a monopoly, self-driving cars or mass deregulation, the company's survival seems more and more unlikely with every passing day.